Well, I'm really sorry I'm not with you in person today, but I hope the whole meeting's going well, and I wish the Calderdale Hub absolutely every success, I really do. Okay, so this is a very brief chat around assessing attainment in computing. I want to start by looking at how we got on with assessing attainment in ICT, though. This was one of the main criticisms of Ofsted when they did subject survey visits under the old curriculum, when they came to look at how ICT was being taught in school, both in the 2005 to 2008 report and in the 2008 to 2011 report. Assessment was really one of the main criticisms of what was going on. And assessment of ICT seemed to be much worse than assessment of the other subjects. So as you see on the slide there, the use of assessment was judged to be no better than satisfactory in 53 out of 86 primary schools visited, for which they observed that, in 42 out of 74 secondary schools. So that's pretty close to 2/3, or at least 3/5 of the schools that they visited. Assessment was no better than satisfactory. Satisfactory, you'll remember now, requires improvement. So that's a pretty pathetic position to find ourselves in. And I wonder what our excuse is for that. How come assessment of ICT was such a challenge? And might these arguments still apply to computing? And it's perhaps worth your pausing the tape now to reflect on that, to chat amongst yourselves about what are the challenges there. Why is it so hard to assess either ICT or computing? To me, there are a number of reasons. Firstly, we make a great virtue, certainly in the primary phase, of having children working together on tasks in ICT, as was and now computing. I think that's a really good idea. Firstly, it's how software gets developed out in the industry. And secondly, we're fairly clear that that's a very effective way of learning, of children talking together, children working together, children making things together. But that does make it hard to assess as an outsider to that conversation, to that work, each child's own individual contribution to that. Also, if you embed ICT across the curriculum or computing across the curriculum, then you've got to make a real effort to identify what the attainment is in computing rather than the attainment in the host subject within which the computing's been embedded. I think that's going to be less of a challenge now for computing than it was for ICT, where an embedded approach was definitely one that was being advocated. The other one, of course, is that it's so hard to tell what a child has learnt through looking at the work that they produce. Even if you avoid the trap of printing things off or doing page after page after page of screenshots, then the work itself doesn't necessarily show you the processes which a child has gone through. Look at some of the requirements on the new programme study about can you use logical reasoning to explain or to predict what a program or an algorithm is going to do. How can you tell that a child has used logical reasoning when all you see is the outcome of their work? And if we're looking for understanding, then simply evidence of skills or evidence of achieving something, of making something, might not in itself be enough. It's worth having a look back at that Ofsted report on ICT 28 to 11 at some of the horror stories that they told about the assessment that they saw, or more to the point, didn't see. In several schools, no assessment of what pupils had achieved in ICT took place at all. And what an appalling situation that is to have found ourselves in. So what does it look like when it's done well? Well, certainly when it comes to assessment in general, Ofsted have fairly clear expectations of what outstanding assessment or outstanding teaching should involve. So teachers systematically and effectively checking their pupils' understanding throughout the lesson, anticipating where they may need to intervene, doing so with notable impact on the quality of learning. Notice that emphasis there on the impact of assessment on learning. It's assessment for learning, certainly not learning for the sake of assessment, I would suggest. But systematically and effectively checking throughout the lesson. And you need some mechanism there for children to give you feedback as to whether they understand what they're doing. And I think the most obvious way of doing that is going to be watching what they're doing and having a chat with them about what they're doing and whether they understand something. And consistently high quality marking, constructive feedback from teachers, ensuring that pupils make rapid gains. We talk about feed forward as well as feedback, setting the targets, encouraging the child to work to something which they can't do already as an important part of that process. And I don't think there's any expectation from Ofsted that feedback, that marking, be on printouts of children's work. Think, please, in terms of the blog as the place for work to be saved, the place for work to be shared, the place for work to be stored. It's also worth recognising that there are people in the room who have a very close idea of what a child understands, what a child learns, and they're going to be the children themselves. If you can devolve some of the responsibility for assessment to the pupils themselves rather than having to do all of that yourself and moderate those judgments, then I think you've made, you'll have won at least part of the battle around making assessment work. I hope that there are schools represented there which have worked towards the NACE, or the original Beck now NACE ICT mark. It's well worth working through the self-review framework. In order to achieve that, there are some expectations in terms of assessment and recording of what we used to call ICT capability, reliable and consistent, of course, informed by the use of ICT across the curriculum, as you'd expect, and statutory reporting requirements are met. But look at the second bullet point there. Pupils regularly assessing their own and other pupils' ICT capability, we might think of that in terms of computing now, based on criteria that they've identified and developed, contributing to their understanding of what constitutes good quality, helps them to improve. So that tight feedback loop between what the child has done and the child recognising what they've learned, the importance of metacognition there, of reflecting on the learning process, I think is something which we would really want to build in to any sort of assessment which we're going to do around computing. And again, I'd advocate the blog as a great place for that, of children not only posting in their work that they've done, embedding their scratch games, whatever, but also their reflection on the process. And okay, tagging that against criteria, tagging that against fairly clearly identified criteria about what they should be achieving. I put together for computing at schools a guide to the computing curriculum for primary teachers, and we've sent a copy of that to every primary school in the country. I hope you've received one of those. If you work in a primary school, there's a secondary one on its way. I've talked in there about aspects of formative assessment, much of which I've already touched on. So the importance of self-assessment, of peer assessment, getting children to review one another's work, using open questioning as a way of getting at that level of understanding rather than merely looking at the piece of work which the child has produced, of the importance of discussion, the importance of your setting targets and children setting targets for themselves. And if you've not used one already, then these KWL grids of what a child knows, what they want to learn, and then reflecting on what they've learned are an effective mechanism for doing that. And I don't think it requires me to spell out the ways in which technology can help, can support all of those elements there, and I will, if you need me to, just spell out BLOG, the blog, as a great way of sharing some of that evidence. So my friends at NACE have convened an assessment panel and put together some really good advice about approaches to assessing the new computing curriculum. One of the things which they're advocating is the use of open-ended questioning, or the technical interview at the end of the project, as a way of getting to that level of understanding there. And they suggest that the technical interview can be between a pupil and a teacher, or can be between a pupil and their peers. And you might want to involve some of your digital leaders, if you're using digital leaders, or children in one class helping with the assessment of children in another. There are ways of doing that across different year groups, or bringing in the experts from outside of the class. If you're working with Code Club volunteers, why not have them come and help you with these technical interviews, as sitting on a panel and asking the interesting questions. And again, NACE have put together some suggestions for questions that you can use for that. So compare and contrast one approach with another, asking the child to describe what they've done, but also getting those questions about why they've done it that way, and why that way rather than any other, and how might they improve on what they've done. Okay, I want to look now though at the more summative approach to assessment, and particularly now that levels have been removed and not replaced in the national curriculum. Tim Oates and the rest of the expert panel, including Dylan William, Andrew Pollard, who put together the framework for the national curriculum, make a fairly persuasive case for the removal of levels. They argue that levels may inhibit the overall performance of our system and actually undermine learning, that using levels actually has a significant effect of exacerbating social differentiation. The gap between your highest and lowest achieving pupils is already very wide when they join a reception class or year one, and it seems to get wider and wider through the time which they spend in the school system, when it should surely be narrowing. And our approach in this country of attainment or ability-based grouping and teaching children according to what level they've already achieved seems to make that gap widen rather than narrowing it. And there's strong evidence, or at least there is some evidence, that seems to be the case. And pupils becoming more concerned, you'll have all heard it, and Ofsted, in fact, to be fair, did something to encourage it. Children being more concerned about what level they are than actually what they know, what they've learnt, and what they need to learn next. So the Secretary of State, although he doesn't accept all of Oates and others' recommendations there, he does accept this one on the removal of levels in order to ensure that every child is expected to master the content of the curriculum. He decided that the current system of levels and level descriptors should be removed and not replaced, and that's certainly the case that we see with the foundation subjects, computing included. A slightly different story over in English and Maths, where we're talking about performance measures now, but certainly for the foundation subjects there are no levels. Of course you can use them, you're allowed to use whatever approach to assessment you want, I'll return to that in a moment or two, but there's no requirement or expectation that you do that. The Secretary of State has to, by law, specify an attainment target. It's how the national curriculum is defined as a programme of study, as an attainment target, and as assessment arrangements. And so the attainment target now sets for every key stage, for every subject, exactly the same sentence. By the end of each key stage, pupils are expected to know, apply and understand the matters, skills and processes specified in the relevant programme of study. And it's a very, very simple model of assessment. Here is the content of the programme of study, then assessment is merely, has the child learnt that? Can they know, apply and understand the matters, skills and processes specified in the body of knowledge, the programme of study, that you have taught? And that's a very, very easy thing to assess. I certainly wouldn't leave it until the end of the key stage. I'd want to keep track of that over a period of time throughout the key stage, regularly checking what a child has learnt, allowing them to provide evidence of what they've been able to master, of what they know, can apply and understand, and then ticking that off on a list of the statements from the programme of study. I'll show you what I mean by that in a moment. We saw further advice from the department issued in the autumn term. Essentially, it's up to you how you go about assessment. I'm aware that many schools are taking a pragmatic stance and going with the system which they know, that of levels. If that's what you choose to do, then that's fine. Other opportunities are available. But what you can't do is simply use the old ICT level descriptors to assess the new computing curriculum because of the significant changes that we've seen. But as I say, there are much more interesting approaches, and coming up with something that looks like a level descriptor actually hides so much of the detail into that long body of prose. So what I'd advocate is breaking it down into the component clauses. And again, in the guide for primary teachers, we've done a similar thing on the CAS website. Now, if you click on the link on the slide, which won't make sense if you're watching this on video. Never mind. Okay, what we've done with the programme of study for primary, and I've worked with my colleague Pete Camp to do a similar thing for the Key Stage 3 curriculum, is to take the statements in the programme of study, to break them down into their individual clauses, to order them as computer science, information technology and digital literacy. That's the foundations, applications and implications of computing, and to put those into some sort of vague order from the easier statements in Key Stage 1 through to the harder statements down at the end of Key Stage 2. And as I say, we've done a similar thing now for Key Stage 3. So what you have there is a list of bullet points where you can ask a child, or you yourself as somebody assessing their work, tick off the evidence of attainment when you see it. So there on their blog, here is evidence that I can use sequence in my programs. Here is evidence that I can work with variables. And over the time of a key stage, a child should build up a whole rich portfolio of evidence demonstrating all of that, all of those statements being met. Some you'll have much more evidence of than you will of others. So, for instance, designing and creating systems. I think many of us would be hard-pushed to see many children providing more than one piece of evidence for having achieved that during the time in which they're in Key Stage 2, although that, of course, is part of the programme of study requirements. The other thing we've done here, of course, is to label these as Band 1, Band 2, down to Band 5 here for some of the harder statements in Key Stage 2 programme of study. And if you wanted to use those as levels, then there's the opportunity, I'm sure, to do so, although I don't think there's any need to do that. Tracking progress year on year, or even term on term, is simply a case of, well, at the start of Year 4, a child could do this. By the end of Year 4, a child can do that, and look at how much more they've been able to learn whilst they've been working in Year 4 there. And of course, for you as the Year 5 teacher, teaching a whole cohort of children, what's more helpful for you, knowing what level a child is, or knowing what it is that they've been able to demonstrate that they can do, and what is still waiting to be ticked off, waiting to be assessed over the remainder of the Key Stage over the year in which they're going to be with you, for instance. Those of you who have been working in early years will recognise this sort of approach from the way in which we build up a profile of a child's attainment against the early learning goals. And some of you, I'm sure, will think back to your time working with the teaching standards or the QTS requirements in terms in which this is a not dissimilar approach from providing a portfolio of evidence that you've met those standards. So it's very much a standards-driven, evidence-based approach to assessment. And I thought that would work very, very well for assessing computing and avoid many of the problems in the past. It is worth acknowledging that other approaches are available. My colleagues Mark Dorling, Matthew Walker have been working with CAS and I believe Hodder to produce the computing progression pathways, which are based very much on the old Computing at School's computer science curriculum. So the strands here, algorithms, programming and development, data and data representation, hardware and processing, communications and networks, are very much based on that computer science aspect of the curriculum. But I think it is worth making sure that any approach you take to assessing computing includes the full breadth that we have in the new computing curriculum, not just the computer science requirements, although I'm sure this could be made to fit that sort of approach too. I just want to conclude by giving you just a few heads up to some of the fresh opportunities for assessment. The Scratch community site, what a great place to share the work which your child has done in Scratch, and to use the notes on there, the submission notes, to say what programming ideas, what aspects, perhaps even of the programme of study requirements, a programme provides evidence of, and the discussion that you can have, the forum threads underneath those programmes. What a great place for talking about how a program works and how a program could be included. If you've not seen it already, I encourage you to go off and search for Scrape from happyanalyzing.com, which will take a body of Scratch projects, and for instance, one child's Scratch projects on the Scratch community site, and analyse which blocks they use in which projects. So you can see at a glance there which blocks are used a lot, which blocks are used very rarely. The blocks that are used very rarely suggest perhaps that's an aspect of programming that your child might not yet have mastered. So if you see lots and lots of repeats, lots and lots of ifs, if-then blocks, evidence of variables being used, then Scrape will provide evidence or a summary of evidence there of attainment against those aspects of the programming requirements on the programme of study. Whether that shows you your child has understood something is another matter. Hence, I would suggest a technical interview. I've mentioned blogging already, so just blogging really. It's such a good place to share the work which your child does. Set up individual blogs for pupils, put that inside a walled garden so that's not shared with the public, and encourage them to build up that evidence over a long period of time of what they can do. We're using this with our PGCE trainees this year and it's worked so well. And then of course we have the aggregator site which sums up all of those posts so they can share them with one another. Again, if you wished, inside the walled garden. We've been doing this for a number of years now with sort of blogging e-portfolio type solutions. So this is one example of doing that against a set of tags. So the tags that we use are derived from the QTS or teaching standard requirements. The tags that you use in a system perhaps similar to that could be derived from those statements from the programme of study. The other really interesting area, of course, around assessment is badges, and I'm sure that there'll be some in the room who are familiar with Scouts, Clubs, Cubs, Brownies guides, which have this badge-based approach to assessment, that to work for a badge there's a list of published criteria there of what you have to do in order to be awarded the badge. You show your portfolio of evidence again to a teacher, to an assessor, I should say, who then says, yes, there's evidence here that you've met the requirements for the badge, and the badge gets awarded and gets sewn on your sleeve. Our friends at Mozilla, the people who bring us Firefox, done a very, very similar thing using this open badge infrastructure which they've developed, and you can use that as a way of providing credentials of achievement. Now, that's something which is only available for 13 plus using Mozilla's own framework, but MakeWaves have a system which will allow that to happen again inside a semi-walled garden, or at least a shared space, closer to an allotment, I would suggest, than a walled garden, without the issues around storing data for under 13s. And that's very much the approach which we've taken with the switched on computing commercial scheme of work I've been working on, where what we've done for a unit, this is the year 3 one on programming, is break that down. What happens in the unit we've broken down into individual assessment statements, the should, the all, the most, the some type statements there, and then link those back to the more general requirements of the programme of study, and then a cluster of those statements on the programme of study. Once the child's provided evidence of meeting all of the ones in one of those original bullet points, then the badge can be awarded, and it's up to the teacher, up to the school to decide how much of that evidence is necessary for the award of a badge. So then, for instance, we have a couple of badges, both around those programming requirements, the planning aspects of the programming requirements. So Problem Solver 1, this Key Stage 1 badge, explain what an algorithm is, explain how algorithms are made into programs, and explain how a program is a set of clear instructions. Child provides evidence of that and then is awarded Problem Solver 1 badge. Okay, I'm sorry I'm not there in person to field questions on that, but I might be around on the Twitter stream. Do tweet if you'd like, or just get in touch via email. I don't blog very often, but if I do, then there's a blog address there. I hope that's been useful for at least some of you in the room, and I'd look forward to seeing some of the feedback via Twitter or our other channels. Okay, thanks very much. I hope the rest of the evening goes well for you all.